Aloha and welcome to our video on speciation. In this video we are going to describe methods scientists use to classify things. We'll talk a little bit about Charles Darwin and his speciation theories and some causes of speciation. We'll distinguish between the biological and ecological species concepts, and then finally we'll look over some different types of speciation. So it's pretty much human nature to want to classify things. Living things are no different. Scientists have been trying to classify them forever by joining the like groups together and such like that. What we've noticed is over time, our ability to classify things has changed. Initially, it was done purely on physical looks and what looked alike we thought to be related, and later we developed different ways of testing things, and primarily now we'll use a lot of genetic comparison to determine these relationships. But as you can see, the classifying of living things is a very important goal of science. And remember, science is trying to make sense of the world, so if we can put things together into groups, it makes it easier to talk and study about these things. Now, as always, when we talk about evolution, we always seem to talk about Darwin. And Darwin had a really interesting observation in the Galapagos Island. He was looking at finches. And the Galapagos Islands, you can see them, they're down here, they're off the coast of South America. And they're kind of too far for a bird to simply fly from South America to the Galapagos and back. Okay, it was a little bit of a distance there, so they couldn't really just take off from the coast, fly out to the islands for a little while, and then come back. So it was kind of a big distance. What Darwin assumed was that one of these finches, the ancestral finch per se, was sitting here on the mainland and was flying and got swept up in a storm or something and was blown out to sea and managed to find the island and land. Now, once on the land, it had to find food, it had to find shelter, and because there were different food sources, what we notice is if you look at, here's just 4 of them, but if you look at the difference in the beaks, you can see that these birds have developed these characteristics to allow them to exploit a new type of food source. Okay, so you could have a multi-purpose feeder like this one down here. You could have one that goes after insects and holes because he has a more pointed nose here, and then you have one here that could open up big, thick, heavy seeds. So this variation in what they fed off of allowed them to differentiate amongst themselves, and that's probably how this speciation occurred. And what they found is on different islands there were different food sources, and that's why there's different populations of finches on all the different islands. Okay, when we're talking about speciation, we have to understand what a species is. And there's 2 different concepts that I want to go over with you in the video today. The first is the biological species concept. And the biological species concept says that a species is a group of organisms that are able to reproduce, and their offspring are able to reproduce as well. So a group of donkeys is a species because if you take 2 of those donkeys and they reproduce, the offspring, the baby donkey that they have, will be able to reproduce as well. And the same is true with horses. Now, donkeys and horses kind of look alike, so what would happen if they were put together in a species? Could they breed? And in fact they can, and when a donkey and a horse are bred, the result is a mule. Unfortunately for the mule, they're not able to have offspring. So a mule makes it, even though that the donkey and the horse have the ability to breed together, their offspring's not able to reproduce, and that's what separates these 2 into 2 different species. So now that we know what a biological species is, let's take a look at ecological species. So biological species dealt with the biology of reproduction. Ecological species deal with a niche. And what they say is that for an organism or a group of organisms to be a species, they have to exploit a single niche. They all share that single niche together. So the key aspects of the definition are the resources exploited and the habitat occupied. So what is it doing in there? What's its role? How does it fit into nature? Where does it live? And that's kind of how we define a species. So even though we have 2 ecological species, those 2 species could in fact breed together and have viable offspring, but they're separated. For instance, if I had a population over here and I had another population over here, I could have 2 different species because they explore 2 different niches, even though if we were to take some of both of these and put them together, they could breed. So it's not real easy to define what a species is. We kind of know what it is, But to break it down to the hardcore definition, something to stick to, is where we run into a little bit of problem in science. So if we understand what a species is, but we have a problem defining it, the reason that could be is because how a speciation occurs. And I want to show you just a couple real quick simple examples of how this works. The easiest one that we see a lot of is this one here, this allopatric speciation. And notice in all of our examples, we're going to start off with an original population, and then something's going to happen. So for allopatric, what we get is a barrier formation, and this could be a mountain range could pop up, or it could be a river, or it could be an island splitting into two, or it could just be simply a population of animals getting lost and separating themselves by a physical barrier. Once they're separated, we'll notice that if conditions were the same as they were, there's no change. But if we have something new kind of a condition here, then we start seeing natural selection take over. And we start seeing different traits favored, and those different traits become more prevalent, and eventually we get into speciation. And then we'll end up with our two species that even if we take away that barrier, we still end up with our two distinct species. So allopatric means that there's a physical barrier that is formed. Now, the opposite of that would be sympatric. And sympatric, again, we start here, but notice here, we're noticing that we have genetic polymorphism. What that means is two distinctly different variants. And over time, there's no separation between the two. We have our two different populations there, but they're in the same location. There's just some kind of a selective pressure on these individuals that makes them choose there as opposed to here. So it could be a color variant, or it could be a size variant, whatever the case may be, but we're having a choice, a selection of this one here. So we form out a new population, a new species within the same geographic range. And then, as you can see, they're already here together. So when they blend together, we're going to see that we have two distinctly different species. Now, we can see some different ones here. Peripatric and parapatric, what we're looking at is going into a new niche, okay? And then it can either be isolated or not, becomes behavioral. Okay, so allopatric is going to be geographical separation. Sympatric will be more behavioral separation. And you can kind of see that it can be a little bit in the same as well. Okay, so that's it for our video. As always, the lessons will go into a little more detail. Good luck with the lessons, and we'll see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to our Conditions for Speciation to Occur video. Today we are going to talk about how speciation occurs. We're also going to compare three different theories on the rate of speciation. So we'll talk about punctuated equilibrium and the coordinated stasis theory, as well as what it was before. Okay, if you can recall from the last video, we talked a little bit about speciation. And what I want to do is I want to talk to you a little bit more about that. Now, speciation occurs when we have a population. So we're always going to have our original population. And then what we notice is there's some kind of a change in the selective pressures. So whether it's natural selection or whether it's behavioral, but somehow or another there's going to be a change in the selective pressure on the different alleles or on the different variants, and that's what's going to cause speciation to occur. So with allopatric, we talked about this geographic barrier. If we have one population, it gets split in two by like a mountain range or something, then what we notice is over time we have two distinctly different populations. Parapatric here is going to be where it's just partially separated, and we can see some of the original population here, but then we'll see it split into our two new populations as well. Sympatric is this genetic polymorphism, and that would be more behavioral, where we might have the population splitting and saying we want to have this, and this trait's more important, and some will breed for that trait, and others, members of the species, will not. So it tends to be more behavioral. So we can see that speciation is when we have a difference in the selective pressure on an allele, and then that'll lead to that speciation. Okay, and generally I'm saying an allele, but generally it's going to be a little bit more. It'll be like a bunch of them together and cause some kind of a variation or difference. So one of the big debates is this rate of speciation. How fast does it happen? When does it happen? And that kind of things are those questions. Now, our older theories of evolution tend to fall under this phyletic gradualism. And what that means is that species change over time, but it's long periods of time. So we start off with an ancestral species, and then all of a sudden there's a little shift that some might want to be darker and some might want to be lighter. And over time, we'll see some intermediate species, and then finally we end up with our two modern species where they're going to be distinctly different colored and different species. So it's just a slow, gradual change. Okay, and that's what phyletic gradualism is. Then we can have punctuated equilibrium, and punctuated equilibrium says that you have these long periods of time with nothing going on, and then you have a rapid evolutionary change. So right here you'd see a rapid evolutionary change. Right here you'd see a rapid evolutionary change. But this species here might still be the same species. It's just gone through periods of like stasis, no changing. Stasis kind of means that it's just stationary. It's not having any decision to change. Life is good. It's happy. Okay, but if you presented an opportunity to exploit a new niche or something, that's when you see rapid evolution occurring. And then finally, we have this coordinated stasis idea. And that says that many new species at once. And that's typical after mass extinctions. So what we're talking about is like right here, you could have had something huge. So let's just take the dinosaurs were evolving. They evolved into their species. They're going to be replaced by new species over time, but they were kind of happy there. And then this big asteroid came and plowed into the Earth. And that caused a huge global change, a global shift in the environment. And that was causing mass extinctions. And then after that, because all of those niches that dinosaurs used to fill were open, that allowed for this rapid bloom of many new species coming in because you had animals coming in and starting to exploit new niches. So punctuated equilibrium and coordinated stasis kind of sound the same. Punctuated equilibrium is more tied to individual species, whereas coordinated stasis say that there's a lot of species happening at the same time because you have these global mass extinctions and it causes an opening for evolution to occur. Okay, so that's it for this video. Good luck with the lessons. They'll go into a little more detail, and as always, we'll see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to the Conditions That Affect Species Survival video. In this video, we'll talk a little bit about mass extinctions. We'll also talk about the process of speciation in new areas, and then we'll end up with a short discussion on genetic health of a species. So as we've been talking about, speciation occurs when there is a shift in the environment primarily. So when something happens to the environment, then we get new pressures, and those new pressures are going to choose different traits, and that's what's going to cause this speciation to occur. Now, one of the things we notice is throughout history, geologic history that is, we've had what we call mass extinctions. And that's where we have a lot of species go extinct all at the same time. Perhaps the most common one that we know about was this one here that happened at the end of the Cretaceous period. And that's where we lost about half of the species, maybe a little bit more than that. And that was when we had our impact of our meteorite that came down. It triggered some severe volcanism. It kicked up a lot of ash. The plants died, and that caused the animals to die. But this here was the death of the dinosaurs. So we took out an entire category of animal, not a species, but an entire category. All the dinosaurs went extinct, and that allowed the mammals to fill the niches and birds to fill the niches and things of that nature, so that we saw this great explosion of speciation because there is new areas to exploit for those different organisms. But what I wanted to show you in this slide is you can see that we've had these mass extinctions periodically throughout geologic history. So it's not something that's brand new, it's something that happens. And that's kind of why we allowed ourselves to think that this idea of coordinated stasis might exist, because when we have these worldwide mass extinctions, it opens it up for a lot of evolution to happen. Okay, another thing they talk about is speciation in new areas, and there's two different ideas that they touch on. The first is co-adaptation, and co-adaptation is when you have two species that are working towards a common goal, benefiting each other, and as such, when one evolves, it causes the other one to evolve as well. So we see two species that are evolving at the same rate over the same time, and they're maintaining that relationship. Another one is this instantaneous speciation, and that's primarily in plants. And what that'll happen is when you have plants that you have that mutation or something changes and instantly you have a new species. They're no longer able to cross-pollinate, or they won't cross-pollinate. So instantaneous speciation generally happens more in plants, where you can see this separation and this speciation happening quicker. Okay, the last topic that we want to talk about is genetic health. And genetic health tells us how healthy a population is, because remember, we're talking about a population and evolution affecting the gene pool or the total genome of that species. So we have some real simple things. If there's over 500 individuals, generally we consider that to be a healthy population. There's enough variation in the breeding and things like that that you're creating that variation in a deep gene pool so it can survive. When you get under 100 organisms, it gets to be a little bit worrisome. When you have a small population like that, we start to see some harmful genes occurring greater frequencies. They're always there, but they just show up a little bit more. They're a little more prevalent. And then when we get down to small numbers like 50 or so, then it's kind of, you get to a point where you can't come back, and that's where extinction happens. So the genetic health kind of tells us the number of animals. And this is why we have endangered species and we have threatened species and things of that nature, is it kind of shows us how healthy that species is in reference to its genetic. So if it's near threatened or threatened, it's going to be like worrisome. When they become endangered or critically endangered, that's when we're talking about only a few of those left, and there's not a big enough population for it to bounce back if anything were to happen. Okay, so that's it for our video. As always, good luck in the lessons, and we'll see you in the next video.